So welcome everyone to the safety connection for today of what's a hazard and how do you manage risk. My name is Stephanie Smith. I'm Senior Health and Safety Consultant with Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, and I'll be leading today. So to better understand who is participating in our safety connections and ensure we are providing accessible training for all people in Ontario, we would like to invite you to participate in a short survey. We are collecting demographic information on behalf of our founder, the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, and Training and Skills Development. Your responses will be kept secure and anonymous, and the MLITSD will not receive any personal information. WSPS will be analyzing the survey results in aggregate form prior to sending them to the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, and Training and Skills Development. Of course, completing this survey or answering any of the questions is optional. To access the survey, click on the link in the chat and on the screen, or you can scan the QR code on your phone electronic device. You will need a 6-digit function number to start the survey, which is shown on the screen and available in the meeting chat. Thank you for taking the time to complete this survey and helping to make health and safety training accessible to all. So before we start with today's webinar, I'd like to take an opportunity to review some of the webinar housekeeping features with all of you. Firstly, we recommend using your computer audio with headphones, but phone conference audio is also available. The phone conference audio details can be found in the access email you received earlier. Your camera and microphone will remain off for the remainder of this session as well. However, if you do have a question and you type it in to the chat and I'm not understanding it, I will ask one of my helpers to unmute you so that we can get more information about the question being asked as well. So as in this meeting, you have options to use reactions that can be accessed through the menu bar. Reactions are instant and will float up on the screen. We will be asking poll questions throughout the webinar as well. So they're going to pop up on your screen or in the meeting chat. So please select the answer and submit to participate in the poll question. Depending on your organization's security, you may not be able to interact with the poll question. So if that is determined to be the case, please use the chat to answer and participate in that poll question. And the meeting chat is accessed in the menu bar, and the chat is public and is seen by all, and messages can be sent to the chat at any time. So Microsoft offers two accessibility features, which may be of use to enable live captions. Select More in the menu bar, select Language and Speech, and then turn on the live captions. To enable full screen mode, select View, and from the menu bar, More options, and then full screen. Both features can be disabled using the same instructions. If you have any technical difficulties throughout the webinar, please send a message in the chat or respond to the access email you received earlier. The Safety Connection program has 4 main goals: to learn, share, and discover what is of value to you, our customers, and our community, to connect virtually with industry peers, and to facilitate a best practice exchange, and to provide an opportunity to attend a health and safety webinar from your personal workplace. So now, this is the end of the housekeeping. We're going to move into the objectives of today and today's presentation. I'll let Jessica answer that question. So by the end of the session today, you will be able to identify what is a hazard and what is the importance of identifying hazards in your workplace. You'll understand how to prepare to do a hazard assessment and understand some practical steps to do a basic hazard assessment in your workplace. So the first question I have is, the poll is going to pop up, is what is your biggest challenges with hazard assessments? You want to type it in or? Has anyone done any hazard assessments at their workplaces or tried to do hazard assessments in the past? Yep, getting buy-in and understanding from staff is definitely difficult. Um, okay. Lack of knowledge in the industry, the risk assessment process. Yeah. Anything else? Support. Yeah, support is always difficult. Not knowledgeable in hazard assessments. How to identify a hazard? Yes, knowing what to look for. hmm And knowing what's a hazard. Yeah, so I'm seeing some general themes of kind of knowing what a hazard is. Buy-in is key. Involving all parties, choosing the correct type. hmm we're going to have some discussions about that today. Is how do you choose the right type of hazard assessment? Prioritizing which hazards to focus on. Again, we'll have that discussion today. Okay, so those are some great answers. And very on theme of what we see with the struggle when it comes to hazard assessments in general. So first off, what are hazard assessments? So when we look at hazard assessments, they're a systematic process to identify what are the hazards in your workplace. They help to evaluate the risk of that hazard. So it's great to identify the hazard, but understanding the risk of that hazard, what injury could it cause? What priority level is it is really important because that helps shape your occupational health and safety management system moving forward. And they also help to implement controls to eliminate or minimize the risk. So they're helping identify what controls are in place to protect from that risk level and how to minimize that risk level. So first off, in order to do a hazard assessment, you need to understand what a hazard is. So a hazard is anything that can cause harm to you or the people you work with. That harm can be a physical injury, but it can also be damage to your health, whether it's health long term, as well as mental health. It can be also damage to property and to the environment. And then risk is that chance of that harm occurring and how serious that harm could be. So not every hazard has the same amount of risk level. And that's what we're going to talk about today is how do you assess that risk? How do you know what level of hazard this is? And where do I prioritize my actions after I've done this risk assessment? So today we're using this model. I'm sure many of you have probably seen the race model before, but we're going to be using this kind of in a different format in a formal risk assessment format. So however, you can use this model daily on your day-to-day activities of every time you're looking at a hazard on the workforce, when you're out on your workplace or out on the floor, is being one, able to recognize a hazard. So identifying what is an existing or a potential hazard, and then gathering information about that hazard, being able to assess that hazard, so determining the risk level of that hazard. And I'm going to show you today kind of how to do that in a practical sense. Controls, so identifying the controls. So controls help to eliminate or reduce that hazard. And then evaluate is check if that hazard has been eliminated or controlled. And again, this is a continuous cycle. So when we look at hazard assessments, why are they important? Why do health and safety professionals advocate for hazard assessments? So the first thing is they help increase awareness and hazards on the floor or in your workplace. So what hazard assessments are doing is they are identifying those hazards in your workplace so that one, it can be used for training purposes for new workers and for supervisors to understand what is on the floor and what could cause harm. They identify who is at risk. So when we look at hazard assessments, we are looking at the different hazards in the different departments, and some departments may have hazards that other departments don't. If we think to anyone who has a maintenance department, they may be exposed to things that somebody who's possibly in the office is not exposed to. So what the hazard assessments are doing is it's identifying who is at risk and what is that risk level. We can evaluate the existing controls. And I'm going to show you that later on when we start to evaluate and actually risk assess, we take into account the current controls and the effectiveness of that control in eliminating or controlling the hazard. It can highlight gaps in your system as well, where maybe a control isn't effectively working, or we don't have a control in place for that hazard. which helps navigate of where to prioritize your actions moving forward. It can help prevent incidents. If we know what the hazards are and we know what the controls are in place and we know that they're effective, it can help prevent accidents in the workplace. And it can help support compliance and other requirements. So there are industries out there and in some regulations where hazard assessments are required, or you may be having a health and safety management system like an ISO system, or you may be using core and you're required to do hazard assessments. So they can help support compliance in that way, or any of the other requirements that you subscribe to. And again, this is sort of just another really big circle of why we're doing hazard assessments and the importance of assessments. So we can use this kind of methodology when we're talking to get buy-in of why they're important. So preparing for your hazard assessment. So we've now understood why hazard assessments matter in the workplace and why safety people advocate for them so much. But now we want to look at how do we prepare for one? How do we get buy-in? How do we properly make sure that one is effective in the workplace? So in this section, we're going to be covering off the assessment types, which I did see someone type in of like how to know what assessment type I need and what risk factors to use. So we're going to talk about the assessment types, picking the right hazard assessment for your workplace. Step 2 is selecting a team. How do you get the right people involved to make sure that your hazard assessment will be effective? And then step 3 is that risk methodology, clarifying what risk factors are you going to use? What risk methodology are you going to use so that your hazard assessment is effective? So the first step is what type of risk assessment is required. So you're going to hear people, especially safety people, we say hazard assessments, risk assessments. You'll hear us talk, and I know we love acronyms in health and safety. You'll hear us say JHA, JTAs, JSAs. So that's job hazard analysis, job task analysis, job safety analysis. You might have heard the term field level hazard assessment, that's FLHA. You might have heard non-routine work permits or permit to work programs that have risk assessments inside of them. So in safety, we love a risk assessment, and there's various forms. So if you're starting out, how do you know which one to use? So some of this is dictated to us if you are following, depending on your organization, if you're got a regulation or a standard or other requirement you must align to, it may tell you what type of assessment you need. So if it's a regulation, if you think of construction and mining, they use a lot of JHAs, JTAs, which I'll talk about in a minute. ISO systems require risk assessments. If you're committed to an ISO management system, you're required to do a risk assessment, not just looking at the hazards that are present in your workplace, but also the risk to the system. If you are under core, you are required to do hazard assessments. Or you may have a corporate or head office requirement to do a certain type of hazard assessment or JHA, depending. So it is important before you begin is what are you trying to align to? Do you have any of these requirements that you must align to before you start to do your hazard assessment? So the first one we'll look at today, and what we're going to focus most of today on, is just the general hazard assessment. So this is a high-level overview of your workplace and departments and your operations. It is identifying your broad hazards and risks. It helps aid in the general hazard awareness in your workplace. What are your hazards? And what controls do you have in place? It can support also strategic planning. So what these hazard assessments can do is help prioritize where your highest risks and what do you need to be focusing on over the next year or 2 years or 3 years in order to reduce that risk. It can also help prioritize areas where you need more details. So maybe it is saying, hey, we have an MSD hazard, so musculoskeletal disorder, that maybe we need to have a further assessment, a more detailed assessment coming in. Or there's a chemical exposure. We may need more chemical exposure assessments done, so like a hygiene assessment. Some of the limitations, of course, of hazard assessments is they can be time consuming. Today, what I'm going to go through with you is trying to show you how to set up this hazard assessment that maybe it won't be as time consuming moving forward by doing some base work first. Risk ratings can be subjective. Our risk ratings can be very subjective. And what I'm also going to do today is show you some tips and tricks of how to make it a little less subjective and make it easier to be able to risk assess moving forward. They also may miss some task specifics if you have a very high level, high detail task. The key takeaway with hazard assessments is they're dominant where the goal is to understand the overall workplace hazards and risks. So things like manufacturing, warehousing, retail, where the work is very repetitive, these are great for. The next step is what we call JHAs, JTAs, or JSAs. They often complement hazard assessments. So they are task specific. They are breaking down the steps of that job into individual steps and identifying the hazards of every step of that. And what they're doing is basically creating a safe work procedure about how to do that job safely by breaking down the steps and understanding the hazards of the steps. It's prominent where work is task driven and variable and can be non-routine. The benefits of this is one, it improves worker awareness about that specific task. It may detect previously unnoticed hazards from the bigger kind of general hazard assessment, the broad one. And it's good for newer routine tasks or those high risk jobs. So if you think of maintenance jobs, or I had automotive industry for years, I was in automotive industry. We had a tool shop where they had to flip dies. Dies are very heavy that are used in presses. That job is very dangerous to flip that die. So we had JHAs created for how to flip that die to make sure that step by step that step was done correctly because it was so dangerous. We're really loading and unloading a cell, like an assembly cell, very repetitive. It could be done in the general hazard assessment. The limitations of JHAs is it is resource intensive. You need the workers and the supervisors who are conducting that specific task there with you. It needs frequent updating. So anytime a task changes or a control changes, you have to update all the JHAs that are impacted by that task or by that control that's changed. It may not capture the systematic risk. So because it's focused on that specific job, it may miss some of the other jobs that may impact that task. And they may create a lot of content. If you are doing them for every single job that you have on your floor, you may have a lot of JHAs created. So key takeaway here is it is useful in industries where how the job is done determines the safety. So things like construction, maintenance jobs, and mining, we see a lot of JHAs because it's to take looking at that specific job and the tasks of that job. The next one is field level hazard assessments. So they're a quick check before starting the job. So again, they often complement the bigger hazard assessment and then the JHA. And what they're doing is it's incorporating things like changing weather or site conditions that may impact how the job is done. They don't replace hazard assessments or JHAs, but they complement them. So it is a real-time hazard identification considering current conditions. So if you're outside and you're doing work and it's pouring rain that day, you would do a field level hazard assessment of how to do that job safely, or different construction companies coming in every day to the site. It ensures that controls in place before the work is started, and any deviations from that control must be approved. It's completed by workers and supervisors because it's a real-time check. The limitations again is it's limited to the current task and the current controls. It may miss again some of those broader hazard. It requires buy-in if it's not legally required. And workers and supervisors may not be trained in the process. So you really have to make sure that workers and supervisors are trained in this process to make sure it's effective. So again, it's best used in dynamic and changing environments, confirming that those conditions are safe for them to start that task. So if we look overview of what I just talked about, because I know going through it kind of fast, is hazard assessments identify hazards and risks in your company. There's the broad level overreaching kind of document. JSAs, JHAs, JTAs, they're defining safe work methods. So they're looking at a specific task and breaking that task down to look at the hazards of every single step of that task. And the field level hazard assessment basically verifies the conditions of the JSA so that they can do that task that day right in the field. So the more dynamic and hazardous and task variable the industry is, the more it's going to rely on JHAs and JSAs and field level hazard assessments. If your workplace is very repetitive, you'll probably rely more on just hazard assessments. So to ask another question, a polling question, what type of assessment does your workplace use most often? Are you using hazard assessments? Are you using JHAs or JTAs or field level hazard assessments? Or what one do you think will be most effective in your workplace? See hazard assessment. Some of you are using JHAs, JTAs, and some of you are using field level hazard assessments. Yeah. Mhm. So in my workplace too, my old workplace, we definitely had a combination of what we were using. We started with a hazard assessment and then moved down from there. Yeah, task analysis. So quite some variation. That's good to see. So today what we're going to focus on a lot more is the hazard assessment portion. However, the same kind of methodology and thinking and moving through this process will help with creating JHAs and JTAs and field level hazard assessments. So the next step, once you've decided what type of hazard assessment you need, is you have to select your team. Who is involved? Depending on what hazard assessment form you're using, is who is involved in creating that hazard assessment. So when we look at selecting the team, they're most effective when the right people are involved in the process. It should never be just one person doing it all. So if we look, we want the employer involved. They're leading or ensuring that the assessments are done. They're providing the resources and controls to one, get the assessments done, as well as make sure the hazards are controlled. And ultimately, if we're looking at the act, they are legally responsible to control hazards in the workplace. One way to control hazards is you have to identify what the hazards are, and hazard assessments helps to do that. You may also have the health and safety person involved. They can help kind of streamline that process, set it up, capture the data, as well as provide the information for the legal requirements or the standard requirements. You want supervisors involved because they're providing input on the operations and the hazards. They know what tasks are happening and they should know what the hazards are in the workplace and the controls. And they're going to help implement any further controls. And they ensure that those findings from the hazard assessments are communicated. Workers. Workers are your key piece of information when it comes to creating hazard assessments because they know the job. They know what the hazards are. They will tell you everything. So they can identify real hazards based on experience, as well as potential hazards, things that they've seen in the past. They can validate the data as well. They can tell you if that control is working. They can tell you, are they following that procedure? And they're going to tell you that information when you're going through and you're assessing your hazards. And under the IRS system, they are also required to report hazards. You may also have the JHSE involved in your risk assessment and your hazard assessments. They can participate in hazard identification. They can help review and recommend improvements. And they're often involved in inspections. Depends on your company of are they involved at the very beginning from the very first step, or are they involved kind of later to review? And again, it's all determined too for JHSE of if you are required to have it legally or not, speaking wise of if you're required to do hazard assessments or not. I always advocate that JHSE is a great involvement from the very beginning of the process. But they can also come in after and review. You can do it in consultation with them. It's all up to your location. But you want to include those people who are familiar with the law, the work, and for implementing controls, as well as those individuals who can inform you of the effectiveness of those controls. So that's why workers are key, supervisors are key contributors to that. As well, when you're going through, depending on what type of assessment you're doing, like if we think field level hazard assessment, that is done by the workers and the supervisors because they're the ones doing the real-time information. Where maybe the hazard assessment process is you've got the health and safety person involved, you've got the supervisor, you may have managers, you may have other end workers involved. So it's a variety of people. But again, you want to select your team ahead of time. Who are you going to have involved? JHSE, you may have different members involved for different sections as well, because you want the JHSE member who knows about the information about the hazards of that area as well. So the next step is selecting your risk methodology. And this is where things can get a little complex when it comes to doing your hazard assessments. You want to choose your method. There's no one size fits all methodology out there. So you want to match the method to your organizational needs, your industry expectations, and the level of detail required. What type of assessment do you need? What type of methodology do you need is determined by your organization. Then you want to define your risk factors. So I know that was one of the things brought up earlier was, well, what risk factors do I use? And again, there's a lot of them out there. So you can decide which dimensions of risk you'll rate based on what you need. So you could be looking at frequency. How often is a task done? How often are workers exposed to that hazard? Likelihood and probability. In some matrices, they are two different functions, and in some, they are almost the same. When we go in and do hazard assessments as workplace safety and prevention services, we have frequency and likelihood that makes probability. And then probability and severity give the risk rating. But likelihood, probability, that's looking at how likely that hazard is to cause harm. And you want to always be considering when you're looking at likelihood and you're looking at probability of with your current controls in place and the effectiveness of those controls in place. And then severity is the most probable injury to occur. Then you want to select your risk rating approach. And again, there's a lot of different ones out there. So you can have a matrix style, which is like a box style with it could be number combinations with words. You could have a straight multiplication system where it's just straight multiplication across, or it can be additive systems where you just add all the numbers and it gives you a risk rating number. So again, there's a lot of different ones out there, but it's choosing the one that works for you in your organization. I'm going to show you one today. I'm also going to show you another one that we use for a lot of small businesses as well, but just to give you some examples of some simple ones that can be used. So for today, for simplicity, we're going to use probability. So how likely of injury or illness with the current controls in place and taking into account the effectiveness of that control, which I'm going to kind of show you in a bit how to do that. Yeah, so we do a lot with not under 20 employees in construction. Yeah, so construction requirements are a little bit different than industry, but definitely the same methodologies can be used for construction. Is making sure that again, you're doing your JHAs if they're required and who is required to be on that team will be dictated by the regulations, which is why it's important before you begin your hazard assessment process, you know what regulations that you're applying to. So yeah, yeah, answering being less. So yeah, it's construction. So when it comes to probability, we're looking at the most probable injury to occur with the current controls in place. So this is one methodology. And then we're going to look at severity, so the most probable injury to occur. If anyone wants to write in the chat box, why do you say most probable injury to occur? Why would we not use most severe injury? Can anyone take a wild guess why sometimes we just say don't use most severe injury to occur when we're risk rating? Yeah, everything would be rated high risk. Yeah, everyone's getting fatality or permanent disability. Yeah, definitely. Even just a simple slip, trip, and fall, if the right way, could cause a permanent disability. So that's why we like to say most probable injury to occur, just because then it's not skewing your risk ratings, because we want to give a real life risk rating. So now we've determined what type of risk assessment we need, who needs to be involved, which again will be dictated by legal requirements. So again, like construction will have different requirements than industrial. Mining will have different requirements. If you are using an ISO system, you may be required to involve certain people as well, or you may have an internal system as well that's saying certain people have to be involved. So it's selecting the right team, selecting what type of risk methodology you're using, and overall, what risk assessment type are you using? So now is conducting your actual hazard assessment. How can we go about doing this and keeping it easy and simple to follow? So today what I'm going to be using is this chart here, where it's going through main activities, your primary hazard, giving some details about that hazard, uh, identifying controls, and then using probability and severity to give a risk rating. We do have another form out there, which I just want to show briefly. This is what we use for small businesses. It's a simple template that can be downloaded for free from our website. If you're a small business or you're new to risk assessments, it's very simple. It's kind of same idea, but all it's using is sort of yes and no's to determine risk level. So likelihood, yes or no, consequence, yes or no, and then risk rating. And that will give you your risk rating. So it's a very simple, kind of easy to follow tool that we have online for small businesses, but anyone can use it as well. So when you're doing a risk assessment, so similar to that methodology I showed you earlier, we have kind of a roadmap of first we want to identify the departments and tasks. And this can actually eat up a lot of time of how do you break down a hazard assessment? How do we break it down in our organization? Then identifying the hazards, outlining your current controls, assessing the risk, and then evaluate and improve. So the first step is identify your departments. So if we got earlier to what I was talking about earlier of the different types of hazard assessments, I just kind of wanted to show this visually what I was talking about. So most companies, you have departments, you may have jobs or positions, then those jobs and positions may have tasks, and then you may have steps for each one of those jobs and positions. Hazard assessments are looking kind of at the top three. So it's looking at departments, jobs and positions, and kind of the big task items that they're doing. Where JTAs sort of focus down here at the task that's being done and the steps of that task to look at the hazards. So that's where the kind of the visual breakdown is. So if we think of the main work areas of place, I'm going to kind of give two examples. So if we think of a typical industrial manufacturing facility, we have our workplace. Now, how do we break this down to do our hazard assessments logically? Well, and again, this is simple. I know this is going to be very high level simplicity, but let's say we break it down this way. We know we have shipping and receiving. They've got unique hazards. We may have stocking or material handlers in our facilities. We may also have production, the ones who are doing the jobs from the day-to-day kind of loading and unloading cells. Now, inside production, we may have multiple different departments. If the tasks are very similar, you could group them together. I came from an automotive world where we had like assembly and press, or I would probably put press as its own and assembly, because even though they share some similar hazards, the risk levels may be slightly different of a very large press compared to a small welding robot. We may have maintenance departments or facilities, however you're calling them. You may have some quality control people who are walking the floor and doing quality control purposes, and you may have office workers. So this is kind of that first step of your hazard assessment is how do you break it down? And then where do you start? So you may want to start with the most complicated department. You may want to start with your department that impacts the most amount of people. This is all depending on kind of where you want to start. But the first thing to do is visualize what's my breakdown of my workplace? What are the different departments? If I think to something like a retail sector, I may have customer service, like sales associates who are on the floor speaking with customers who are front facing. I may have inventory people in the back room taking inventory or stocking inventory. I may have cleaners that come in at night. I may have a merchandiser who orders merchandise and is going in and doing checks, or I may have supervisors. So this is another way you can just kind of visually break down even a simpler workplace of how do I break it down to start this department. The next step is once you determine your breakdown of your different departments and how you're going to proceed, you then want to break down your department into 4 or 5 of the main tasks that are being done. You can separate it out by each zone, but if your zones are kind of all similar, maybe it is grouping it based on a department. And then depending on your organization, you may have different positions in there as well. So all depending on kind of how you want to break it down. But this is where you want to get your supervisors involved and your workers involved and sit down and say, okay, what are the main tasks that you're doing? And remember, all activities are not just tied to a specific task. So if we think again, sorry, that's not going forward. Here we go. We think back to that diagram I showed you earlier where we had a manufacturing facility. One of the departments was production. What are the main activities that could happen at production? So maybe the top 5 things is they do some material handling. They load and unload racks in their areas. They may be handling finished and raw goods, depending. Maybe they're loading and unloading product from pieces of equipment. They could be cleaning as well at the end of shift, beginning of shift. And maybe they do some setup or unjamming of products, but those are kind of the main tasks that are being done. And that's what the discussions, when you're having discussions with the supervisors and workers to understand what are your main tasks. So we're not going to itty gritty into every possible thing. We're trying to cover the main tasks for the bigger hazard assessment. But at the same time, we want to look at things that maybe aren't directly tied to one of their tasks that they're doing, but it's kind of all activities. So if you think of a lot of production facilities, they're loud. It's noise. It's not necessarily tied directly to a specific task or every single task you'd want to list it, You could basically call it all activity tasks. That is just hazards affecting everyone. Heat stress as we're heading into summertime. We know a lot of places are hot. We're not necessarily going to list it 5 times. We'd probably list it one and call it all activities, heat stress, exposure to extreme temperatures. But this is sort of one way to break it down. If we think of like a retail sector, you may say, hey, there's stocking of product for a retail worker. Maybe they're assisting with customers. That's posing hazards. They're handling cash and they may do some cleaning. So those are the main tasks that they're doing, as well as there may be some all activity tasks. So this is a simple way to identify your main work tasks for a department. And this is your starting point. Because now what you're going to do is break down this into identifying all your hazards of those main kind of groupings. So when we talk about hazards, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this hazard wheel if you've taken any training through WSPS before. We have this hazard wheel. They're including both obvious and foreseeable hazards. We separated into 6. There are other types of hazard identification tools out there. Again, if your workplace uses something different, then make sure that you're using that. We want to expand the details. So not only do we want to identify like as a safety hazard, we want to expand the details so that whoever is reading that assessment understands what it is you're talking about and what is the potential outcome. And we may want to group things. And this is what I'm going to talk to you as we go through this process, but how is the idea to group hazards together so that you're not creating a hazard assessment that's hundreds of lines long, but instead is more manageable and doable for you. And then also never limit yourself just to task-specific hazards. Include environmental and work layout and organizational. So if we think, I know this is small, but this is kind of give an overview of hazards. So physical hazards are the invisible hazards. You can't see them, but you can feel them. So things like extreme temperatures. We're headed into summer. We are going to have heat alert days. We've had some heat alert days already. That's a physical hazard. Noise is a physical hazard. Vibration can be a physical hazard. Exposure to radiation is a physical hazard. Chemical hazards, so things like confined spaces that may have atmospheric hazards are a chemical hazard. Could be harmful substances, gases, fumes, vapors, dust. All those are chemical hazards. Biological hazards, they're ones that tend to get forgotten about sometimes when we're doing the hazard assessments, is animals, plants, diseases, mold. Are those present in your workplace? MSD hazards, those are awkward postures, force, repetition, contact stress as well. Psychosocial hazards, that's violence and harassment and stress in the workplace. A lot of psychosocial hazards we can lump into an all activity category when it comes to hazard assessments, because a lot of times they're not necessarily to one specific task. It's probably everyone's feeling violence and could be exposed to violence and harassment in the workplace. So we can say everyone. Now, if it's a customer service agent, maybe their risk level is a little bit higher. And then safety hazards, that's kind of the catch-all other category. So we're looking at like hazardous energy, slips, trips, and falls. Very common, moving vehicles, sharps, struck by injuries. So what we're doing is now if we look at what type of hazard categories are present in your workplace, if you think of your workplace and the hazards present, and you can choose multiple, what types of hazards are present in your workplace or that you know are present in your workplace? Do you have psychosocial, chemical, MSD, biological, physical, and safety? Safety. Safety is a huge one. Chemical, MSD, yep. MSD is one of the leading causes of injuries. Biological, physical. Okay. So you can see we have quite a diverse range of hazards present. Okay, that's good. So when we go through the hazard assessment, we want to be identifying these. So if we think back to the hazard assessment sheet I showed you earlier, we have our hazard identification. We've identified our department. We've identified the tasks, kind of the main 4 or 5 tasks that we're doing. So if we're thinking like loading and unloading a cell, we're not going step by step through loading and unloading the cell. We're just calling it loading and unloading. And now I'm identifying that hazard. I'm saying, well, it could be chemical, safety, whatever chemical, whatever safety hazard I'm finding. So if I give an example here, Here's an example of kind of one filled out of saying, okay, it's a safety hazard. Is the risk of the robot maybe striking a worker while they load or unload a part? Or is the safety hazard of a worker slips, trips, and falls on ergomat or stuff on the floor? I just kind of simply said what it is. So instead of just saying safety, I'm giving a little bit of an explanation in kind of simple terminology of what it is to give an idea to someone else who may be looking at this later. What am I talking about? Now, what we do is we've identified the different hazards present. We want to identify what controls do we currently have in place. And this is where I'm going to start talking a little bit about ideas for combining kind of risks together. So I'm sure everyone here has seen where we talk about the hierarchy of controls. So controls are implemented to reduce or eliminate hazards, but not all controls are equal. Same as we say that not all hazards are equal, not all controls are equal. So controls occur at the source, so that's elimination and substitution, along the path, which is engineering and awareness, and then at the worker, which is administrative and PPE. So when we look at our hierarchy of controls, the most effective is eliminate, get rid of the hazard. Not always possible. We can try to substitute at the hazard, so substituting out with a less hazardous product. I worked in industries for years where we used very hazardous products for cleaning purposes. We were able to use an aqueous-based cleaner at one point, substituting it out. So it's less hazardous to human health. Takes longer to use the process, but it was less hazardous. So we substituted out that hazard. Engineering controls is isolating workers from the hazard. So things like guarding or ventilation systems is isolating the worker from that hazard. Or equipment redesign. Awareness is like signage, alarms, painted floors. Admin, that's training, supervision, procedures, and practices. Or PPE, which is personal protective equipment. Why do you think PPE is the least effective control in place? Can anyone guess? I could put it in the chat of why don't we like to rely on only PPE? Yeah, it relies on people. Yeah, compliance, human behavior. Yeah, people that wear it. Why also do we not like to rely only on awareness and training? Yeah, it's strictly up to the worker. What's some of the problems with awareness and training? Had anybody here ever speed on the highway? That you've always followed that signage? Yeah, various perceptions. People forget. Definitely. And when it comes to like awareness and admin, we're humans. We make mistakes. We have a lot on our minds every single day, and sometimes we forget. We miss things. No one here has ever sped on a highway, I'm sure, but it's looking at that of there's signage telling us a speed limit, and yet people are above the speed limit. So we know we don't always pay attention to signage or relying on memory, yeah, for other things. So it's why these are the least effective because it's relying on us as humans, and we have a lot on our minds, and we do make mistakes. So thinking about that now, on the controls in place, if we look back to that safety assessment I keep showing you, where we've got here's the safety hazard, we have robots. This is the way that I do it. You don't have to do it this way. I just do this because I am a process person and I like to show myself aligning to that hierarchy of controls. When I'm filling in my current controls, I like to say engineering control. Here's the controls in place. I've got like maybe light curtain to detect workers to stop a robot. I've got guarding to prevent access to the robot. And then in min, I have workers trained on safeguarding processes. And maybe I have got pre-shift inspections to make sure that that guarding is in place, hasn't been removed, and that light curtain is working, so it hasn't been bypassed. And maybe I've preventative maintenance on equipment. If I think of the slips, trips, and falls, I'm relying a lot on an admin here. I'm saying maybe we have a 5S program in place. Workers are trained to remove the trip hazards, but I'm relying on people in this process, where the one above, I can put in an engineering control. So it's a little bit of a stronger control in place. Now, this is what I talked about before of this idea of maybe consider grouping stuff. And I know I'm giving examples for industry here, but you can think of it the same way. If you have a lot of, let's say, production equipment, so you've got welders, you have robots, instead of calling out each individual hazard of saying risk by robot, risk of crash, risk of getting caught in the welder, Instead of listing each one separately, this is where you're thinking that maybe you could combine. I like to combine hazards if my controls are all the same. So instead of even saying like slip, trip, and falls like 10 times in an assessment, I may say it once. This is for all processes. And what I'll do is I will expand either the hazard description along the side to say, yeah, now it's machine hazards. So it's not specific just to robot now. I'm saying it's machine hazards. It's a risk of a robot striking a worker, a risk of getting caught in a fixture, an automated part, a risk of entanglement in a conveyor. So instead of mentioning that 5 times down a line items, I'm mentioning it once because all the controls are the same. It's mostly I'm using guarding controls or safeguarding devices. I'm making sure workers are trained on it. So I'm keeping it kind of combined together just to create one less line in my hazard assessment so it's more doable for me later to manage this. Same as workers slipping and falling. You can have that as one big line item of saying it's just workers trips and falls. It's all up to your organization how you want to do this, but it's just a suggestion to consider grouping where possible. Now, the next step is assessing the risk. And this is where subjectivity gets entered into the picture. So first off, when we look at assessing the risk, today we're looking just at probability. So how likely is that injury to happen with the current controls in place? And severity is the most probable injury for that to occur. You may have other factors in place, but today, just for ease of use, I'm going to be talking about those two. Tips for consistency is clarifying what the ratings mean by giving some structure around it, which I'm going to talk about next. And using industry experience as a guide as well is really important when we're looking at hazard assessments and ratings. And then, as I said before, you can add other risk factors. If you want to use frequency, you're using frequency, go ahead and use it. Just today for use, I'm just talking about the two. So when we look at our probability risk rating, we say 1 is certain, it's very likely to occur. 2 is likely it could happen. 3 seldom. It could happen. Very rare is 4. 5 is very unlikely. Problem with this, though, laid out right now is everyone is going to be risk assessing it slightly different because there's subjectivity involved. There's not a lot of kind of the meat and potatoes here. So I'm going to give you an example. And I want everyone to answer. So we've got a workplace that has workers use painted pedestrian walkways that cross forklift, and the forklifts have to cross those aisles. There's no physical barriers separating pedestrians and forklifts. There are marked intersections where workers are instructed and trained to walk across that forklift aisle to get from one area of the plant to another. And workers are trained in pedestrian safety. So let's bring up the whole question is, 1, what do you think the likelihood is of a worker getting struck by a forklift with just this scenario of just painted walkways, forklifts have to cross, people are crossing at designated locations, are trained to do that. What do you think your probability is? Like, what would you rate your probability with that current control system of just saying very likely, likely it could happen, rare, seldom? Yeah. And just do what you want for here. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. P1, very likely. Yeah. Okay. And this is great. So as people finish filling in, do you notice that a lot of this is, we're kind of wide apart, a lot of 2s and 3s, some 4s, some 5s, but you notice how there's a lot of subjectivity here. It's all based on who's filling it in right now. So what I wanted to do today was give an idea of, well, what happens if we define this criteria a little bit more? So when I go into sites and I'm doing hazard assessments, because I'm a kind of system person and I want to try to be consistent, and I want to make sure that whoever is looking at the hazard assessment later has some idea of where is Stephanie coming from when she calls this like rare is going to happen or saying likely it's going to happen. Why is Stephanie coming up with this? Yeah, always nice to look back on instance too. Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in a minute as well. So if we look back to this chart, what I like to do, and again, this is just me, but as one suggestion I do say, as you start to develop your risk methodologies, is maybe expand on this a little bit more, because what is rare to me will be different than what is rare to someone else in the organization or someone else in this call. But what I find I do, and again, this is just me, it's just a hint, I expand this a little. And I look back to thinking of the hierarchy of controls. I look back into controls and I say, okay, one likely to occur is there's no control in place. Absolutely nothing. I say a two saying is likely to occur, saying, okay, maybe I have one control in place, but it's relying on workers. So it's either like one training, or I have one procedure, or I'm just relying on PPE. And we know as human beings, we do mess up occasionally. Our minds are on different things. I'm sure all of us have occasionally been driving home and all of a sudden you're looking at that stop sign and you know it's there. You've driven that way a million times and you slam on your brakes because you almost forgot because you're thinking about you have to make dinner, you have to get the kids to bed, you got to get the kids to baseball or whatever you've got on. Your minds are on a million different things. So if we're only relying on one control, chances are, and it's all human beings, chances are the injury is going to happen eventually. Rare is maybe I have admin and PPE controls in place. So I kind of have two things, or awareness and PPE. I don't go past a three normally, unless it's an extenuating circumstance, when I'm relying just on humans. Because again, we make mistakes. We have a lot of things going on in our heads, and sometimes we zone out. So that's why I just never go past a three unless it's an extenuating circumstance. For me, if I start to introduce an engineering control, then maybe I'll go to a four, as long as it's effective. If I can reach through a guard and I know that engineering control is not working, I'm not giving it a four. I'm going to give an explanation of why it's not going to a four. But if I've introduced an engineering control, I go to a four. If I've introduced an engineering control and I have admin controls in place, as well as to support that control to make sure it stays effective, like such as training and PM programs and inspections, then I'd go to a five. So as you can see with this, what I've done is sort of created criteria around what does likely mean, what does rare mean, all also tying back to the hierarchy of controls and knowing that as you enter into engineering controls, you're less likely for that injury to occur as long as that engineering control is effective. So this is what I do. Again, it's tips and tricks today. You may want to expand a little bit more before you go into creating your hazard assessments and doing this with people. Like if you're training supervisors and workers, giving them a little bit more explanation like this type of thing helps them because it helps make that criteria easier to understand. So now if we go back to this situation, thinking back to my incident here, I have painted walkways, which is more of an awareness control. I've trained people, it's awareness as well. I've got, well, let's say that forklifts technically do have horns on them, but again, it's awareness. What do we think now? If you're thinking of this idea before where we're saying likely could happen, it's only one worker central control. Maybe we have two people entirely focused on the worker. I have very seldom I've got an engineering control. What do you think now? Yeah, that's great. So we still have some like P4s and P2s and P3s, but you notice here now we're a little bit more aligned in our process. We've kind of gotten rid of a little bit of that subjectivity because we've created a little bit more criteria around what are we talking about when we talk about rare and seldom. And again, there's always extenuating circumstances where you may move numbers up and down depending on the situation. But you see kind of here how maybe explaining something a little bit more, giving a little bit more detail may help organizations later on when they're doing the hazard assessments align. So again, this is what I do. You can create your own, but I would suggest this one thing is expand on your risk ratings a little. Give a little bit more explanations and examples, and it becomes a lot easier when you're risk assessing. That's great. So now severity, you can do the same thing. So S1 here, we're saying fatality or permanent disability. S2, we're saying serious injury, S3, moderate injury, and so on. Another thing you can do again is expand this out a little bit more. Like if we're thinking, hey, where would a breaking of an arm be in here? Would that be serious injury, permanent disability, or would that be moderate? You may want to expand this out a little bit more and provide a little bit more detail about what you're talking about. Bumps and bruises, is that a minor injury with first aid, so an S4, or is it negligible? It's no first aid required. Yes, they've kind of hurt themselves, but no first aid. So you may want to start expanding this one as well and giving a little bit more explanation behind your risk ratings. And this is the risk matrix we use. Now, again, you're going to use whatever your company wants to use, whether it's addition, multiplication, or a risk matrix. But this is just kind of showing an example that we use. So S1, severity, will tell, along with probability, will give you a risk rating. Now, as you can see here, there may be times where your risks stay high. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit of what we call kind of tolerable risk, acceptable risk, because you can't move out if your severity stays high. But as you see, we have our little matrix here. So now if I go back to my risk rating I keep showing, I have that risk of, let's say, the robot striking, or maybe I've combined it now to be machine hazards. Now, I've said it's a P5 here, because if I go back to my risk chart that I showed earlier, that probability chart I showed earlier, I've said I have engineering controls and they're working effectively. The guards are there, the light curtains are working, preventing access to the robot. I have admin controls in place. I am checking daily to make sure those light curtains are working. All of my workers are trained on why the light curtain is there and why the guarding is there. I also have PMs on equipment to make sure everything's running efficiently. So now when I'm saying it's a P5, it can kind of give you an idea of why, if we think back to, I have multiple controls in place. Now, if I'm looking at my engineering control later and I'm saying, hey, I can still reach into that robot through the guarding, I'm not going to give it a 5. I would derate it down to a 4 or a 3 because the control isn't effective. But this kind of gives you a reasoning of, now all of a sudden, let's say a year from now, someone else is looking at the assessment, because they followed through with that probability column, they'll understand why I called it a P5 here. They'll be like, oh, Stephanie called it P5 because there's multiple controls. And S2 of saying, okay, maybe the injury isn't as severe, that maybe it's smaller robots. Yes, it could still be a very bad injury, but I'm not worried about permanent or fatality. If we go to this admin control, slips, trips, and falls. So we know that we are relying totally on human beings at this point. You can kind of understand why I've said a P3 here. Maybe here, again, this could be up for debate of whether we call it a negligible injury or first aid. It could be S5 or S4. But at least you kind of get an idea of why I'm saying certain things on that risk assessment, why I'm calling out certain levels now. I'm saying, I think it's going to be a P3 because I'm using that methodology. It's not up for debate as much anymore. And then before I move on, does that kind of make sense now to people, that risk methodology and expanding it a little bit to get rid of some of that subjectivity? Okay, so the next step is that if you've assessed all your risk, and this is what you're just going to go do, is go through each one of those hazards doing the same thing. At the end, see where you can combine some of those hazards, especially if you have the same control. I talked about earlier kind of extenuating circumstances where maybe I also wouldn't combine hazards. So let's say that you have table saws in your organization. And let's say you have 2 types of table saws. You have the older table saw type, but you also have those newer like saw stop ones that don't necessarily cut the hand as bad. I probably wouldn't combine those because my severity in this case would be very different. Me getting cut by a table saw could have a very severe injury compared to me getting cut by one of those ones with the technology in place that can't really cut hands. It can still cut, but it's not going to cause an amputation. Those ones I would typically call out on 2 separate lines. But if I have a lot of machine hazards that they're all sharing the same severity level, they're all sharing the same controls, chances are I'm going to combine them, just make them one less line item. And then write in the wording in the description of saying it's multiple areas, or this equipment, this equipment, this equipment. But your next step now is you've done your hazard assessment, is to evaluate and improve. The first step we have to look at when we talk about evaluate and improve is what we call tolerable risk. So as we showed in that risk rating before, if I go back for a second, you can see that I have this risk rating here. If I have something like, if I think of, anyone have electricians here? Does anyone have electricians in the workplaces? You just want to kind of put up your hand if you do have one. Yeah. So electricians have quite a dangerous work field. When they're exposed to possibilities of live electrical or arc flash, their most probable injury could be fatality or permanent disability. Anyone working from heights too, the most probable injury could be severity-wise of an S1. But you notice here that sometimes it could be really hard to get yourself down to a medium risk, depending on your risk matrices that you're using. So you may stay at a high risk, or you could get down to medium. But again, this is all kind of showing that sometimes your risk matrix will keep something a little bit higher. So when we're looking at this, then we may call something tolerable risk or acceptable risk. So it's a risk level deemed acceptable by the organization after considering legal, regulatory, and operational requirements. So what this is kind of doing, if I think of my little diagram that I've created, when we go through hazard assessments, we're identifying the hazards. We're identifying the controls implemented already. We're assessing that hazard with those controls implemented and the effectiveness of those controls. And now we have to determine, is the control adequate or not? So sometimes you may say, no, I could definitely can still improve controls. But there may be times where you're saying, I've done as much as I can, but it's staying high risk hazard. And that's what we call risk acceptance. So this is where it's a final decision sort of rests with senior management. You're getting input from workers and supervisors saying, is there anything else you can implement? We want to get as low as reasonably achievable. So the ALARA, or as low as reasonably practical. Again, it is a little bit, again, this is a little bit subjective. The one thing we don't want to do with our risk methodology is start playing with the numbers to make something lower risk than it is. It is okay to have a high risk item. If something is very high, okay, yes, probably you don't have enough controls in place, but something could still be high risk and be controlled. And it's because that severity of that injury is so high that we know if it does happen, it is a catastrophic injury, but we have so many controls in place to prevent that from happening. There could be another thing that you may want to say with, if you have a high risk hazard, but you're saying it's controlled, maybe you review that risk more often. Maybe you train more often. But again, you can keep throwing those things in. It's not necessarily going to reduce the risk level on paper, but it gives you more comfort in knowing that that risk, that hazard should not occur in the workplace, that the injury shouldn't occur in the workplace. So that's what we call tolerable risk or acceptable risk level. So as long as you believe that your controls are adequately controlling the hazard, you can say it's tolerable risk. However, there are times that you may want to recommend improvements. So you may want to recommend improvements or additional controls where hazards remain uncontrolled. You got nothing in place, or you know that more controls can be added, or the controls are ineffective or partially effective. So the control is not working as it should. People don't really know the procedure. If people don't know the procedure exists and the control isn't adequate, or if people aren't following the procedure, the control isn't adequate. And you're going to adjust that probability column and your probability rating based on this information. And this is information you're also going to get from workers. They're going to tell you if that control is working. They're going to tell you if they're following procedures or not. They may say, no, that procedure doesn't really work. We do something different. Then you want to improve that control and capture that information. You definitely want to be reassessing after you've made those improvements. So confirm that the recommended control one reduces that level of risk, and that when you're introducing a control, you're not introducing any new hazards into this system. You want to document your findings as well. So anytime that you're putting through a recommendation for a control, a new control, you want to document that and record the decisions and rationale when implementing or not implementing a recommended control. So it could be that maybe that control right now isn't economically feasible, but you're going to look at that in the future. Or, hey, it's going to take a few months to put that control in place, but right now we have this temporary control in place. So you want to document all that information on your assessments of the no and no goes of why you're going to put something in place, or what's the rationale for not putting something in place, or if we're just taking time to put it in place because we have to buy it and it's got to come in and then it's got to be installed. But also, when we do our risk assessments, don't be afraid to ever say no further recommendations at this time. If we believe it's tolerable risk, it's acceptable risk, the risk level is controlled, it is okay to say no further recommendations at this time. Or just continue to monitor and enforce for supervisors. That's okay to say as well. But don't be afraid to say that. Not every single hazard must have a recommendation for every single hazard that we find. Sometimes it is controlled. So the next step is, when should you review the hazard assessments? So if we think, I'm going to open this up to just a chat communication. How often do you review your hazard assessments? Does anyone review their hazard assessments? Yep, reported with near miss or incidents, definitely. Yeah, every 3 years. Once a month. Okay. Sometimes industry will dictate how often you have to review them every year. hmm Yeah. Yep. New equipment introduced. Definitely, you want to be reviewing your hazard assessments. Have you introduced any new hazards into the system? Or does your hazard assessment already cover off that new piece of equipment's hazard? And you just have to add it into that box line. Yep. Twice a year, yearly. So when we evaluate and improve, if we think back to the roadmap I showed you earlier about identifying departments and task hazards, when you're evaluating and improving, you're either going back and looking at the hazard specifically because you're targeting one specific hazard and putting in a control there. So you're kind of starting at step two. But let's say you have a new piece of equipment or you're separating out departments, you're doing a whole new process. You're going back to step one and identifying that department and tasks again. What are the main tasks for that department? And starting there. So your evaluate and improve can either go back to step two or step one, depending on the situation. But when do you look at them is a really big question that is up for, of course, a lot of debate in organizations as well. So you want to set a regular review cycle. How often do you review hazards, your hazard assessments? If you have JHAs and you have a lot, I've been in organizations that can have like 200 plus JHAs because they were told based on their business structure, they had to do a JHA for absolutely everything. It's really hard to review 200 JHAs in 1 year if you're kind of like one person trying to get through that. If you have a few of them, it may be a lot easier. If you have bigger hazard assessments, it's maybe easier to review. But you want to have a review cycle that matches your needs and your resources. And also like what legislative requirements you have, or if you have standard requirements that tell you. If you are adhering to a standard that says you have to do annual reviews, then you have to do annual reviews. If you've written it in your procedure to say annual reviews, you got to get them done annually. If you have something that says every 3 years, that's also okay. You may want though, as we talked earlier about like those tolerable risks and gave the example of the electrician, maybe you review those higher risk ones though a little more often to make sure that all those controls are implemented. There's nothing new, that nothing's happened. Where maybe something that's lower risk you don't review as often. But again, this is make a review cycle that makes sense to your company, your needs, and what you are looking for. You definitely want to be reviewing them after incidents. So after an incident occurred, near miss or an accident, you want to be reviewing your hazard assessments because one, you can capture lessons quickly. You can look at your controls and say, okay, what happened? Was the control not effective that caused that incident happen? Was something not followed? What happened? And you're going to look specifically at that hazard line item and the controls and find out what happened in that situation, because then you can adjust your controls. You can implement new controls. Maybe you have to do further training. It could be that maybe the training wasn't effective and we have to go back and retrain it in a different way. So we definitely want to be looking at it after an accident to say, was there a control in place? Christina? We have a GSP and a hazard assessment. If the incident occurred, we will review it right away, not every 3 years. Yes, that's good. You want to, after any incident, you want to be going back to that hazard assessment. Because plus, maybe your hazard assessment didn't see that hazard. Maybe it missed that hazard. And we want to go back and capture it. Or you may want to re-risk rate it because now you had an incident occur and you're like, oh yeah, that could occur. Let's assess this risk again. When regulations or standards change as well, you want to be looking at your risk assessment and saying, are you capturing that information? Or process changes. If you're changing a process, equipment changes, there's organizational shifts, you definitely want to be going back to your hazard assessments and capturing all that data. It could be that if you're doing JHAs or JSAs and you're changing how that process is done, you definitely have to review that hazard assessment again, that JHA. If you are bringing in a whole new process that you're bringing a paint booth and you've never had paint booths before, you are going to be now going back to that step one, identifying the department and the main tasks of that, and then identifying all the hazards. So you can see there's multiple times where you may be intersecting with the hazard assessment and reviewing it. So having a regular cycle to review is key, and having the right people involved in that review. So again, looking at your team, you'd want to make sure that the supervisors are involved, the health and safety person's involved. You want the Joint Health and Safety Committee definitely reviewing them as well, because they may be seeing stuff and giving input as well. After an incident occurs, go back to your hazard assessment and see, did something fail? Was there a control not identified? Was the control ineffective, or did we not have that hazard identified? Then when regulations change or the standard changes, or you're introducing a new process. And again, keeping it simple. Use plain language, keeping it simple. If we overcomplicate things, it feels like it's an overcomplication. So keep it simple, use plain language, make it so that people can understand. So just some summary recaps as we kind of close out today. To set yourself up for successful, whether it's hazard assessment, JHA, or whatever you're using, is do some planning ahead. You want to prepare that team. You want to say why the importance of hazard assessments are important. So similar to the kind of diagram I showed before of why hazard assessments are important, because they're identifying hazards. They can help with training moving on. They can help making sure your controls are in place and reduce incidents. But when you're planning ahead, you also want to plan who is the team? Who do you need involved? Making sure while you're looking at the legal requirements, does JHSC need to be involved? Making sure workers are involved, making sure that supervisors are involved, that the right people are involved in this process to make it efficient. You want to then set your rating guides. So what criteria are you using? And then clarify that definition. So similar to what I did with probability, I'd recommend doing the same thing, whether it's frequency as well. So if you're using frequency, you may want to expand upon your frequency a little bit, but how do you cover things like heat stress? It may happen several times a year. That's not happening monthly, but it's not happening weekly. Where do you put in something that's maybe happening 20 times a year, up to 30 times a year, but can be variable? So you may expand upon those definitions and those ratings to just give clarity so that it's consistent moving forward, or whoever else is taking it on next can see why you're rating things the way they are. You want to have clear objectives. What's the clear objective of your hazard assessment moving forward? And then create that scope as you begin. What departments are included right now? What may not be as you're moving forward and getting them done? You definitely want to include everybody, but if you're just starting, you may be focusing on production first and then have a game plan of we'll do production, we'll get them done, then we'll move on to maintenance, then move on here, here, and here. So have a game plan, plan ahead. The next one is follow a roadmap. So identify your departments and your major tasks if you're doing hazard assessments. And then identify your hazards, your controls in place, and then risk assess based on those controls. And avoid overcomplicating it. Look for patterns. So identify those recurring hazards. So things like slips, trips, and falls that can be mentioned multiple times. Maybe in your process, you don't want to mention it multiple times. Consider making it one line item. Or if you have something that's sharing the same controls in place, so like machine hazards, maybe it's machine hazards, but expand upon your description a little bit. Say like including drill presses, including robots, including this, and this. So you can expand upon it, but now you've grouped it. So instead of having several line items, you've got one, unless there's something like a severity rating that you want to keep it different. But group where it makes sense, because it's just one less item, so your hazard assessments don't become hundreds of lines long. Maybe they're a little bit shorter and more manageable. And then use the hierarchy of controls. So prioritize eliminating a substitution where possible, and then engineering controls before admin and PPE. And then of course, we're always stacking controls. So when we're putting in our controls in our risk assessments, list all your controls that you have in place. And that also helps then for the person who is looking at your risk assessment and your methodology of why you said something's probability wise, they can see why you said it. And especially if you've clearly laid out saying like eng control and min control and that, you're making it very clear to somebody about where that control lies in the hierarchy of controls and the effectiveness of that control. So again, just thinking back to your roadmap, identify your departments, then identify your hazards, outline your current controls, assess the risk, and then evaluate and improve. And that is it for today. So thank you for attending. If you have any further questions or concerns, you can write them in the chat. But hopefully this kind of helps set you guys up in the future for creating some successful hazard assessments, where to start, laying out a process. Again, game planning a little at the beginning helps to create these things and make them a lot more successful later on when you're implementing them. I can see a question. Someone's got their hand up. I think it's Dave Harvey. Yes, can we have a mute, Dave?
You can, Stephanie. Oh, I think the hand went down.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and Good luck to everyone as they go through this process of creating hazard assessments. Hopefully, you got some tips today, but I found in my industry is always that pre-planning has helped tremendously with getting buy-in from hazard assessments and showing how easy they can be by kind of training everybody in pre-planning and having set guides definitely helps with that success.